Hello and welcome to the fifth webinar as part of the 2020 Waterway Restorations Conference programme, jointly run by the Inland Waterways Association and the Canal and River Trust. My name is Jenny Morris and I'm the Restoration Hubs Coordinator for the Inland Waterways Association. Today's webinar is being run by IWA's Campaign and Public Affairs Manager, Alison Smedley, who will be talking about engaging your local authority and political campaigning. So I'll hand over to Alison to run the presentation.
Great, thanks Jen. So in this webinar, I'm aiming to cover quite a lot. We'll have an overview of how local authorities work, different ways you can interact with them, a bit about what goes on in IWA at a national level to support waterway restoration politically, a bit about engaging with your local MPs, a few case studies along the way, and hopefully, and this is the overall aim of the session, get you thinking about what more you can be doing to engage with local decision makers and influencers to get them behind your project. So just before I start, just by way of an introduction, I'm Alison Smedley and I've worked for IWA as a member of staff for the last 8 years, but it's actually more like 28 years since I first got involved as a volunteer with both IWA and WERG, and I've probably met many of you at some time or another. A while before I joined the IWA staff team, I spent 7 years as an IWA trustee. I'm also a boater and I'm trustee of a local restoration group. As Campaigns and Public Affairs Manager, I lead and coordinate IWA's national campaigning, as well as our parliamentary lobbying activities. But you're just as likely to find me steering a boat or on a work party. So, what is a political campaign? Just before we think about what a political campaign is, I'm having a look at the answers to the poll. And do you currently have a good relationship with all your local authorities? 52% of you have said yes, 16% have said no, and 32% have said some. So I hope that today's session will be helpful for all of you. And I hope that those of you who've already got really good relationships with your local authorities will be able to share your experiences and ideas later on. So what is political campaigning? Let's start with what a campaign is. Here's a couple of definitions for you to read when the screen changes. Political campaigning can be targeted at local authorities or government, either through direct lobbying or by mobilising support and pressure behind an issue. Campaigns tend to either be aimed around changing behaviour or influencing public opinion and attitudes, or they are seeking changes in policy or legislation by influencing decision makers. And I think a campaign to restore any particular waterway is likely to need to combine both of these by influencing public opinion to get broad support for your scheme, as well as influencing decision makers to enable the scheme to happen. So it's this second aspect that we're going to be looking at today, the political aspects of how you can best promote or progress your restoration. And we'll take a look at local authorities first. The move towards greater regionalisation and localism are providing increasing opportunities to influence local government. Changes in local government legislation in every decade since the 70s have led to an ever evolving situation in terms of administrative boundaries. There are a couple of map resources that you can use to check the current situation, magic.gov.uk and also the Ordnance Survey election map, and I've got the addresses for those on a slide later on. Some areas still have the two-tier structure with district or borough councils and a county-wide council, but more and more are changing to unitary authorities, most recently Buckinghamshire just this year on the 1st of April. So there are now 5 different types of council in England alone, with unitary or single-tier councils in many areas, along with the 33 London boroughs and 36 metropolitan districts. Wales now has 22 single-tier authorities, which replaced 8 larger counties, which had 37 districts. And in Scotland, the old 12 regions with smaller districts have been replaced by 32 unitary councils. Then there's also about 12,000 smaller local councils in the UK, town, parish, community, neighbourhood and village councils. And these are well worth engaging with on very local issues or regarding restoration route that maybe passes through them. There's also 10 national parks responsible for conservation and promotion in those areas. And then there are the combined authorities. The passing of yet another piece of legislation in 2009 enabled groups of 2 or more councils to collaborate and take collective decisions across council boundaries. And the Localism Act in 2011 aims to to enable the devolution of decision-making powers from central government control to individuals and communities. Traditionally, mayors were largely ceremonial figures, but this all changed 20 years ago with the passing of the Local Government Act 2000, which requires all local authorities in England and Wales to review their executive arrangements. A number of councils have moved to a mayor and cabinet model, where the mayor is elected by the people, rather than the more traditional leader and cabinet model, where the council leader is selected from the councillors. And curiously, so I've listed them all here, but curiously, at least 2 local authorities have tried out having an elected mayor and have now reverted to the leader and cabinet model. So other than the Mayor of London, who was first elected in 2000, the other metro mayors are actually much more recent, enabled by yet another piece of legislation, the Cities and Local Government Devolution Act. And a number of these were first elected 3 years ago, including Greater Manchester, Liverpool, Cambridge and Peterborough and the West Midlands. And it's always useful to look up the background of any politician that you're trying to engage with. A number of the metro mayors are former MPs who were very supportive of waterways during their time as an MP, including Andy Burnham and Dan Jarvis. And Andy Street from the West Midlands is also known to be a keen hire boater. So, with all needing to engage with the elected politicians and the officers in all these councils, that's an awful lot of different people to develop a relationship with. So what's the best place to start? There are a number of approaches, and you may find that different routes, some of them shown here, will be better suited than others to specific issues or campaigns. Some are more formal, while others are around developing relationships with individuals. And I'll go through some of these in a bit more detail. Some council meetings are open to the public, and members of the public can ask questions. You can check your local council's procedure for submitting public questions on their website. And most councils have a principle of transparency, and they encourage filming, recording, and taking photographs at meetings that are open to the public. One way in which most restoration societies are probably already interacting with local authorities is in their role as the planning authority. It's a good idea to input into local plan updates if you aren't already. And even if you've got the line of your restoration route protected in the local plan, it's still really important to monitor the local authority websites for any planning applications that may affect your restoration. You can search online through the planning portal website, which enables you to search on specific locations to find contact details and links for all the planning authorities. The planning portal can also be useful for when you're thinking about submitting your own planning applications in relation to your restoration project. But my comments here are more about protecting the line of your waterway from development by others. And the planning process was a subject of a different webinar entirely, which took place yesterday, and for actually putting forward planning applications for your restoration work. And I believe that the recording of that will be available shortly. So once on the local authority planning website, you can search for existing applications, you can set up alerts, and you can comment on individual planning applications. It's important to be clear whether you're objecting or supporting a proposal, and to give a detailed reason. Excuse me. For significant developments or issues, it's worth making contact with the planning department. The case officer should be noted on the website listing, and it's worth a personal approach to them to discuss any significant concerns. This can help develop a relationship with the planning department too. While we're on planning, you may be aware of a recent government consultation called Planning for the Future, which proposes whole-scale changes to the planning system. IWA has submitted a formal response put together by our planning advisory panel, which is available on the IWA website. And I should also mention here that IWA's planning and advisory panel is one of the many resources available to restoration societies for advice and support. IWA's response to the government consultation raises a number of concerns, primarily about the loss of protection for waterways from future developments, which will make protection through conservation areas or other existing designations even more important. Conservation areas are designated by the local authority, and you may find whole lengths of waterway or even whole waterways are designated, or sometimes a section of canal will be included in a particular village or town conservation area. A review of an existing conservation area offers a very practical way to engage with the planning authority and to start to developing relationships, which can be helpful later on. So IWA has an aspiration to try to get all navigable waterways protected by being in a designated conservation area, as there are currently many links that are not. We aim to work with local IWA branches to encourage planning authorities to get designations in place. But some restoration schemes may find that conservation area status is less helpful, and it would be really useful for us to understand whether we should be pursuing this idea for derelict waterways and those under restoration, as well as those that are already navigable. So we have a quick poll question for you, which should be appearing on your screens now. Is part or all of your restoration project in a designated conservation area? Yes, no, or part? And do you consider that designation as a conservation area is, or would be, helpful or detrimental to your restoration? So we'll have a look at those results as they come in, and it will be extremely useful in actually helping us decide where we go next with this project, in terms of whether we maybe include restoration projects or not, or maybe just derelict waterways where there's no likelihood of any restoration, so that the line of that is better protected, where active restoration projects might be better off without that designation in terms of progressing your restoration work. So we'll have a look at the results of that when they're available. Hopefully they will be coming up on my screen now. Yes, excellent. So is part or all of your restoration project in a designated conservation area? 17% of you say yes, 39% no, and 43% part of it. Do you consider that designation would be helpful or detrimental? 35% say helpful, 9% detrimental, and 57% of you are neutral on the matter. Okay, well that's actually really useful, and we will definitely bear that in mind as we progress that particular project. Thank you. So back to other ways of engaging with councils. You can submit a petition to a council, provided that it contains a concise statement covering the subject of the petition with lists of names and signatures. The people signing a petition should actually live in the council area. And like the government website, all local authority websites should have an e-petition webpage where you can create e-petitions. Rules will vary across local authorities, and there'll sometimes be a threshold for the number of signatures needed for a response or to trigger a council debate. You can submit a Freedom of Information request. The Freedom of Information Act 2000 gives you the right to access recorded information held by public authorities, which can be really useful. You can request information from public bodies, including government departments, devolved administrations, local councils, publicly owned companies, and private or public companies that have public responsibilities like water companies. Some bodies have an online form that you can submit, while others you need to email or send a letter to. You could propose a cross-party motion and circulate that amongst local political groups, or you could suggest a charter, and we have some sample wording available on request. Elected councillors are responsible for making decisions about local services, which includes planning and land use. It's important to win their support, but even more important to engage with the leaders of each political party or grouping. Where there's no overall political control, you will need cross-party support. Most major decisions are made by a cabinet, which is made up of the key committee chairs and the leader of the council, which may be the elected mayor, as mentioned earlier. So it's a good idea to identify the elected councillors that you need to influence. They will have geographical areas and areas of subject responsibility. So who are the key decision makers? You can meet them at their public surgeries. You can contact them by email, letter or phone. The contact details will be listed on council websites. And councillors often have a pot of money that you can apply to for local projects. So it's worth cultivating relationships with them before you want to apply. And it's also really worth checking how much longer they've got in office before an election. Councillors are elected for 4-year terms, but some councils elect all of their councillors at the same time, while others elect half or a third of their councillors at each election. You can check election cycles on the gov.uk website. And don't forget to engage with the elected mayors in your area if you have one. They will have their own office and contact details published on their websites. So a little bit of a case study for you. There are multiple stories concerning the restoration of this bridge by the Calden and Uttoxeter Canal Trust, and all of them involve partnership. In this context, it's the story of Staffordshire Moorlands District Council, who progressed the compulsory purchase of the bridge through a CPO once it had been established that no one owned the bridge, and then sold it to the trust for £2. This enabled the full restoration of the bridge by a waterway recovery group and a couple of canal camps. The leader of the council, shown here receiving the payment from the local trust chairman, was very supportive throughout the process, but there was also regular dialogue with council officers through the local partnership set up to progress a landscape partnership scheme funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Without both the council and the Canal Trust being part of the Turnip Valley Living Landscape Partnership from the outset, those contacts would have been much harder to establish. So it's really important to get to know the officers in relevant departments. They will probably be in place for much longer than the elected councillors, and there are resources on the internet for finding named contacts. In addition to the local authority website, there are research companies who offer access to a database of local authority contacts for a fee. And there is some information available online, free as well. Officers are accountable to elected councillors, but in reality, the councillors will rely heavily on the advice, experience and the continuity of officers. So it's a good idea to get them on side with your project early on. You'll all be very familiar with this one as a case study, but what a great example of a local authority really embracing the opportunities provided by canal restoration. Stroud District Council are leading the restoration of the Cotswold Canal through their area. The conversion of the canal-side Ebley Mill, shown here, into their own council offices acted as a catalyst for regeneration, which has seen over 115 million of private investment. And the whole area, as any of you who have been there will know, is now transformed. This is a great case study to use when you're talking to your local authorities. It's featured in the Waterways in Progress report, and it's also available as a standalone case study, downloadable from IWA's website. And just a few more thoughts about working in partnership. It's really important, and it's cultivating those relationships which enable partnerships to happen. So it's a good idea to look out for any partnership opportunities or other opportunities to bring waterway organisations and councils together to be a collective voice. So I'm about to run through some of the resources that some of which I've mentioned and some others. But after that, we're going to have a bit of a sharing of ideas about anything that's worked particularly well for you in engaging with local authorities. So if you'd like to start putting your ideas or suggestions in the chat box, we'll come to that in a few moments' time. So some external resources that are available. There's the magic.gov.uk map that I mentioned earlier. There's also the Ordnance Survey election map, and I've got the link to that later on. The planning portal I mentioned earlier. The Local Government Association is the national membership body for local authorities. And it's made up of all English councils. Welsh councils have a separate section called the Welsh Government Association. And then there's the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities for Scottish councils. The government website has lots of information about election cycles and local councils. Surf Your Turf is a free website where you can look up your MP and local authority contacts individually. And it's run by a company who also offer paid subscriptions to databases for all MPs and local authorities. And there's also Solace, the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives. It's a members network for local government and sort of professionals and leaders, the chief executives and senior staff. And IWA exhibited at their conference this time last year, where we took the opportunity to promote IWA's key regeneration messages. And that's what that photograph is of. So there's also the various reports that IWA produces that can be used by all of us to influence local politicians of all types. The Heritage Report is the most recent, and then there's also the Waterways in Progress report. And don't forget also the Waterways in Progress video featuring David Suchet. It's very easy to include a link to it in an email to councillors or officers. Local authorities and decision makers all too frequently overlook investment in the waterways. They tend to think of them as peripheral to their local communities or simply assets that someone else should deal with. The value of the Waterways report is a resource that can help influence these decision makers by demonstrating the value of inland waterways. It brings together previously written reports and studies in order to evidence the many benefits that a waterway can bring to an area. All these are available to download from IWA website. Printed copies are also available on request. And we've recently sent a digital and printed copy of our heritage report to all local authorities with waterways in them, including restoration projects. And we intend to develop relationships with these councils by sending them restoration documents such as Waterways in Progress and other future publications. We hope that this will help support the work that you're all doing locally. So before I move on to talk a bit about parliamentary lobbying and working with your local MPs, do you have any suggestions or ideas that you would like to share with us about anything that's worked particularly well for your restoration in engaging with local authorities?
Yeah, if you could put your ideas in the chat box, that'd be excellent. I can read them out to Alison. So we've got one so far. We cross 3 local authority areas and have regular meetings with councillors and officers in all 3 areas, especially as there are several developments along the canal route, which we're seeking to use as an opportunity. That's a good idea. Just keeping regular contact so important, isn't it, Alison?
Absolutely, yes, definitely. That's great.
This is one from Derby. We have local councils appointed by the council through which the Derby Canal runs. This ensures progress is fed back and provides advice and contact as required. Doesn't work all the time though.
Yes, it's a case of keeping on at it. You might think you've developed all these relationships and people move on, officers leave post, councillors get re-elected or not re-elected, and you have to start all over again. So it is a continual process.
If anyone else got any other ideas,
okay. There's a couple of ideas that I've been involved with locally or have been suggested. One is taking councillors out on a boat trip. If you haven't got a bit of navigable waterway in your area, you could invite them. Obviously, not at the moment. Next year, when life resumes to something more like normal, what's worked very well for us in the past is actually inviting councillors out on a boat trip. And another idea is to suggest they visit a similar sized town, city or village to where your restoration focus is, to see what can be done there. So find an example of a waterway that's either been restored or has always been navigable, but where there's a really good, vibrant interaction between the waterway and the local community, and either suggest that they visit it or even organise a visit for them.
Good, yeah. There's quite a few ones coming through about kind of joint steering groups and kind of canal partnerships as a use of engagement. There's one question actually. Basingstoke Canal obviously have the challenge that it's owned by 2 county councils who are in partnership with 7 districts. And they don't have the councils don't do very little to promote the value of the canal as a local amenity. So how can they get more input from the 8 councils they deal with?
Right, well, that's a really interesting question. So I would need to know exactly more about what you've done in the past in terms of, rather than repeating anything that you've already tried. But that's certainly something that we could get involved with, helping with potentially, and involving the local IWA branch in helping to develop relationships. So that's certainly something we could look at after this session.
Yeah, I think that's mainly all the ideas coming through. So I'll hand back to you, Alison.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So there'll be an opportunity for questions later on as well. But in the meantime, we'll just have a quick look at the parliamentary aspects of political lobbying. So there's 2 aspects really, which can be thought of as Westminster and Whitehall. Westminster is the elected MPs in the UK Parliament, and Whitehall is the ministers and officials in government departments. This is where much of IWA's lobbying activity is carried out, but it will also be relevant to many of you restoration societies on specific issues, or in terms of the impact that decisions and legislation has on the work that you're doing. So what is political lobbying, and why should a restoration society do it? Going back to our earlier definitions, it's generally to deliver change, to resist something, or to raise awareness. Oh, that photograph's on its side. when I'm seeing it. I hope it isn't for you. It wasn't when I looked at my slides earlier. That's interesting. Okay, so parliamentary lobbying activities can be grouped into 4 different areas. There's contact building. So this is about building relationships, which is described as by NCVO as the most useful peacetime activity an organisation can undertake. There's profile raising, which is effectively political PR aimed at boosting recognition. There's policy shaping, engaging with ministers and government departments, and changing legislation. So this could be proposing, blocking, or suggesting amendments to legislation as it goes through the parliamentary process. The most important thing you can do as a restoration society is to establish a relationship with the MPs along your route. MPs are always best contacted through a resident of their constituency in the first place. So if you're starting from scratch, if you have a number of constituencies that your restoration route goes through, it might be a helpful idea to find some members who are happy to be the initial point of contact with those MPs. And within IWA, engaging with MPs is very much a two-way process. We can help by interacting with MPs at Westminster through events, and IWA branches can also help develop relationships with individual MPs, and that in turn can help restoration societies to develop a relationship with them. Contact building has to start afresh every time there's a general election. We seem to have had quite a few of those in recent years. There are 650 constituencies in the UK Parliament, and 420 of these have waterways going through them. So last year, we made publicly available what had previously just been an internal resource that I'd developed, which I hope will be useful for restoration societies to use. It's a spreadsheet listing all the Westminster parliamentary constituencies which have waterways, navigable and restoration projects, and it allows you to check at a glance which constituency any particular waterway is in, the name of the current MP, and also which restoration projects sit in which constituencies. You can sign up to receive a copy of it on the IWA website. IWA holds regular parliamentary events such as receptions and dinners, and many of you probably attended the restoration themed reception that we held last summer. This larger scale event was an opportunity to launch the Waterways in Progress grant scheme and was attended by 45 MPs and Lords, as well as 100 or so representing the restoration sector. After the general election in December, we invited all MPs with waterways to a smaller scale drop-in style reception to introduce them to the waterways, and we followed this up by sending them all a copy of a parliamentary briefing. Last year, we also involved you all in nominating MPs and peers who had been helpful to your projects. Presenting an MP or Lord with a trophy is a very good way of raising the profile of waterways to parliamentarians, and MPs love publicity, so it's always worth inviting them to an event, or if you invite them to attend an event or to go on a boat trip, it's always worth following up with a press release, and it's always worth tagging them in your social media posts. So I could go into a lot more detail about each of these, but I won't in the interests of having some time for more discussion and some questions at the end of this session. But this slide just lists some of the activities that IWA gets involved with at a national level in lobbying Parliament, where we progress opportunities to promote the waterways in terms of both navigable waterways and restoration projects whenever an opportunity arises. Another key aspect that IWA is involved with is the all-party parliamentary group for the waterways. APPGs are cross-party and they involve both MPs and peers. They are run by the parliamentarians involved. There are hundreds of groups on topics such as literally from A to Z, from ageing to zoos. They're not involved in formal decision making, but they are an important way of developing knowledge and making contacts. IWA provides the secretariat, as many of you will know, for the all-party parliamentary group for the waterways. APPGs have to be reconstituted for each new parliament, and one area where you can help is by encouraging your local MPs to join it. Recent topics for meetings for the Waterways APPG have included funding for support for waterway businesses impacted by the COVID lockdown, sustainable propulsion, just a couple of days ago, I don't know whether any of you signed up for that, and waterway restoration, which you should have all been invited to. If anybody didn't receive an invitation to that meeting back in July, let me know and I'll make sure that you're on the list for the next meeting where restoration is going to be discussed, which will be sometime next year. And if your restoration is in Wales or Scotland, you will also need to work with politicians in the devolved government as well as Westminster. What's been devolved differs between the two, and it's changing and evolving over time, with more functions being passed to the devolved administrations. Each parliament also has its own processes and procedures. But because they're relatively small, it can be easier to have a dialogue with both elected representatives and officials than it can within the UK Parliament in London. And the next update of IWA's Parliamentary Directory will include Scottish and Welsh Parliament members. So this year we had a really great case study of how this process can work to benefit a waterway restoration society at a local level, as well as raising awareness of restoration nationally and in Parliament. So following the general election in 2019, IWA branches were encouraged to make contact with the new and re-elected MPs in their areas, and they encouraged them to join the APPG. IWA then nationally invited new and re-elected MPs to the parliamentary reception that we held in January, and IWA branches and restoration groups were asked to encourage MPs to attend and to arrange to meet them there. In this case, IWA Shrewsbury and North Wales branch and the Friends of the Montgomery Canal were successful in meeting up with 3 MPs at the event. IWA campaigns team, we then produced a parliamentary briefing, which was then sent out to all the new and re-elected MPs on our spreadsheet. And the IWA branch and the Friends of the Montgomery Canal followed this up with the MPs to talk about local issues. And as a result of this activity, Craig Williams MP secured an adjournment debate on waterway restoration, with IWA Shrewsbury branch and the Friends of the Montgomery Canal providing briefing information ahead of the debate. And so this resulted in the airing of waterway restoration in Parliament during a debate on the 4th of June. So some more resources, more specifically relating to MPs. You can use the Ordnance Survey Election Maps website to check constituency boundaries and also other administrative boundaries. The parliament.uk website has lots of basic information about MPs. They obviously all have their own individual websites. And you can sign up to receive alerts and find out more about debates and parliamentary questions on the theyworkforyou.com website. As well as the reports that I mentioned earlier, which are all equally relevant for sending to your MP, there's also a current parliamentary briefing aimed specifically at MPs, which highlights the key issues that IWA is campaigning about nationally, and that includes waterway restoration. And then in terms of internal resources, that's the address for the directory MPs with waterways in their constituencies, which you can sign up to get on the IWA website. And that works very well in conjunction with IWA's other directory, which is the waterway directory, detailing all 6,500 miles of waterways ever built. So if you look on the website, it's fairly easy to find those on the website to sign up to. And with both of those, you sign up to receive a downloaded copy, and that will then mean that you receive any future updates. So you all know about IWA's Restoration Hub, or you wouldn't be here today, but you may not know that IWA has other sources of advice available. So you can continue to contact the Restoration Hub via the usual route for most inquiries. But if you have anything specifically related to campaigning, then Amy and I would be happy to hear from you. And we can also pass any inquiries onto the Planning Advisory Panel or the Heritage Advisory Panel. So I hope that's been useful and it's given you all food for thought. And I hope you've all got lots of interesting questions.
Cool. Thank you very much, Alison, for that insight into engaging local authorities and IWA's political campaigning. We've had a few questions in the Q&A box, but if you do have any, we've got a little bit of time, so please keep submitting them. But we'll kick off with the first question. So this one's from George. Just referring back to the poll regarding conservation areas, he selected neutral because he wasn't entirely clear on what the potential advantages and disadvantages would be for actually having the restoration project within a designated conservation area. So would you be able to expand on that, please?
Yes, well, I think it's to do with the fact that there's going to be less, if the current consultation from government about the planning process is anything to go by, there will be less protection in the future unless something is already designated or has some level of protection. So it's a listed structure or it's in a conservation area. So that's the benefit, is it will offer protection, but there may then be some hindrance in terms of actually, if you actually want to do something that is different to what was there originally, changing the line, putting in a new bridge or a new structure, then obviously that might then cause hindrances, and that could be used against it if it's in a conservation area. So hope that answers.
Yeah, thanks, that's great. So we've got a question from David here from Sussex Oods. Her trust has no contact with MPs, councils, regional or local, or any councillors. Where is the best place to start?
Gosh, right, yes. Well, I think it depends what your priorities are and what stages you're at with projects, and who you think might be most useful to you. But I would certainly start by trying to make, I think, a two-pronged attack in terms of making contact with your local MPs. It could just be a letter to introduce your organisation to them, or maybe drop into one of their constituency surgeries to talk to them. And then with councillors, again, they have surgeries that you can drop into just to start a dialogue, really. If you haven't got a specific project that you want to talk to them about, just go along and introduce yourselves and the organisation. You can put something in writing, giving much more detail if you've got any reports or written documents already in print that you've got about your project, leaflets and that sort of thing, just to start to introduce yourselves. Oh, I've just seen the comment from Derek Hunt who's just commented that they've started from bottom up. So they've started with parish councils and are working up towards district and council. So again, it was going to depend on the scale of your project, whether you're looking at a whole restoration that's going through a number of parish council areas, but largely within one, say, district or county council. Then I would start with the district or county. If it's a very small project, just the restoration of a bridge, then you might want to start with the parish or town council.
So this is a bit of a different question. The opposite end, they've tried all the traditional methods of gaining support from their local authority, their MP, and they're just not interested. Are there any different approaches that they could take to try and get a bit of buy-in and support?
Okay, I think these days they take a lot more notice of social media. So maybe do something or create a message that then you can then tag them on in social media, particularly Twitter. So it's very easy to tag an MP's Twitter account, and then the more, I think, that can just bring something to their attention, or maybe come up with a set of half a dozen different issues. They might not take much notice of the first time they're tagged, but by the time they've been tagged half a dozen times, they might start thinking, oh, there's something in this. So think about what your message is and what you want to what the key thing you want to talk to them about, but maybe use something else as a way in, as a lever. So they might not be interested in the concept of a whole restoration, but just interested in one very specific local issue.
Yeah, I suppose the other approach could be as well to go in with your partners. So, if it's like a wildlife trust or another group, they might have a better connection, and you might be able to actually get a forum to speak to them and convince them another way.
Yeah, that's definitely a good idea. Going back to the partnerships thing, yes, definitely. Yes, and if you haven't got any of those partnerships developed, look out for opportunities or make contact with those other groups like the local wildlife trust, local heritage or historic societies.
Yeah, okay, we've got another question here from Chris Madge of Derby. So they live in a non-unitary county, but there's talk of reducing it to unitary. Is this likely to improve our position? And do you have any advice on how to prepare for any change?
Gosh, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? I think the Buckinghamshire example is going to be a really useful one here. I don't know whether Terry's on the call, but I'm sure he would be able to have a view on this. And I think it will be interesting to see what happens there. I think it probably can help, but I think, again, it will depend. A lot of it does depend on individual councillors and their own interests. So try to find in the new council, whether it's going to have an elected mayor, if it's one that's going to appoint an elected or get the people to elect an elected mayor, then that would be a key person for you to try to influence.
Excellent, thanks, Alison. We've got another question from Chris here. Does the Conservative or Labour Party have any specific policies on canals and restoration?
No, I don't believe that either of them do at the moment. We obviously trying to push this message all the time about the wider benefits of canal restoration. It doesn't just benefit people who might want to put a boat on them in the future. It benefits wider society and everybody who lives within walking distance or cycling distance of the waterway. But yes, so far as I know, I don't think, certainly neither of them had anything in their manifesto about that as of the last general election, but that is something we do try to influence.
Okay, I've just seen a question in the chat, back to the Basingstoke actually. So sections of the Basingstoke are threatened with closure because the owners, Hants County Council, have been dragging their feet over implementing repairs. How can they raise the profile of this issue? And they've been considering a campaign cruise. Is that the way to go, or can you suggest a different approach?
Yeah, I think campaign cruises are great for raising the profile of an issue. So yes, a campaign cruise along the rest of the Basingstoke Canal until the point at which you need to be, highlighting. I think probably also finding some case studies of other dead-end waterways where the town or the area at the end is really vibrant and well visited, and the potential for tourism and the input into the local economy that can be gained from that. Off the top of my head, maybe Market Harborough or Llangollen spring to mind. Maybe actually produce a written document with those examples in that you can send to the councillors, so that they can realise what the benefits could be of that being more navigable than it currently is.
Yeah, that's we've got another question here. As a fairly new society that it's been suggested it'd be a good idea to have some patrons. What do you think the advantages of this are, and is it actually a good idea?
Oh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I think patrons, or presidents you might call them, can be useful. I think they can, it depends who they are, and I think it depends whether they're prepared to do anything practical on the ground to progress the restoration. Oh, no, obviously digging with a shovel, but in terms of promoting it, or how profile they are. If you can get somebody really well known, then I think that can certainly lend a sense of, it can enhance the reputation of your organisation, especially if you're quite a new organisation. If you can be seen to be getting those people supporting your project, and I think that can help. But equally, it's, I think, quite an old-fashioned way these days. I don't know how many of the restoration societies actively use their patrons. I know some are, some certainly do. So yes, I mean, for example, I think he's either patron or president of the Lichfield and Haverton Canals Restoration Trust. Michael Fabricant is currently the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for the waterways. So that was actually really helpful in us engaging with him, and he's always been very supportive of the waterways, but obviously it started for him with that local engagement. So actually it's a two-way thing then. If you can get people who've actually got a national influence to support your project, that can actually help promote both your project and waterways generally at a national level too. So yes, worth pursuing, definitely.
Yeah. So just a question more on the political side, national campaigning. How do you go about setting the agenda for the all-parliamentary groups meeting?
Right, well, as I mentioned earlier, APPGs are run entirely by the politicians concerned. So strictly speaking, it's entirely down to them as to what topics they want to speak, how often they want to how often they want to meet, and also who gets invited, whether it's an open meeting for stakeholders or whether it's a closed meeting with just a few people that they want to hear from. And so IWA in providing the Secretariat, we're able to influence those decisions, but it's not directly down to us. So I have a list of topics. At the moment, the plan is that we try to get restoration on the agenda at least once a year. So you'll have noticed that pattern in the last 3 or 4 years or so. And then interspersing that with other topics that, relating specifically to navigable waterways, because we wouldn't want it to become just about the restoration, but also about wider use of the waterways. So in the future, we might have a meeting on the subject of some more sporting use of the waterways, with a speaker from Sport England, for example, talking about the use of waterways by canoes, rowing boats, sailing boats, and that sort of thing. So basically the last meeting I had with Michael Fabricant, I suggested 4 or 5 topics, and he chose the ones that he wanted. But he's very keen on restoration, so restoration, as are we, so that will always be on the agenda in any year.
Excellent.
Equally, if anybody's got any suggestions of topics that they would like aired, so in terms of the restoration topics, when we talk about restoration, it's obviously good to have a specific theme, not just restoration in general. So if anybody's got any particular aspects of restoration and regeneration that you would like us to be covering in the future, let me know, and then I can forward that into the group for them to consider.
Okay. So we've got a few more questions. Actually, just a really good point from Mervyn here. It just says that councils want to see some kind of payback from restoration, whether that be economic, social and environmental. So it's actually quite a good idea to research your council's ambitions in the area and see where your project could fit in. So that's a really relevant point there.
Yeah, that's definitely good advice.
What level of contact is there with the economic bodies such as regional councils and powerhouses, such as in the Midlands Connect, which have conflicting schemes?
Well, yes, there's yet another level of administration. So I think currently there isn't any interaction with those types of regional councils nationally, but I think at branch and region level within IWA there probably is, and I think it's probably a very good thing for IWA regions maybe to be taking a lead on coordinating with the restorations within their region about making contact at a regional level.
Okay, thanks, Alison. We've got time for a few more questions, so I'll just give everyone a minute just to add their questions into the Q&A box. Just to see if we've got anything else. But obviously, if you think of a question after the presentation, then please feel free to email Alison and she'll be able to hopefully help you out or answer your question. So yeah, no, well, it looks like you've answered everyone's questions today with this webinar. So excellent. Well, thank you very much to everyone for joining us for this webinar, and in particular to Alison for sharing all her thoughts and experiences of engaging with local councils. Also like to thank Katie and Alex behind the scenes for making sure this webinar was running smoothly. So we'd really like some feedback from everyone. So once this webinar finishes and the window closes, there'll be a pop-up box which will take you straight to the survey form. So if you could fill that out and complete that, we'd really appreciate that. And also don't forget to join us next week for the last Thursday webinar, and this one focuses on dealing with utilities and is delivered by the lead regional civil engineer from Keir, Wayne Cahill. So excellent, well, thank you very much, and we hope to see you all next week.